Bob, you and your network were broadcasting the NBA final as that Bronco chase was playing out, which just set up this extraordinary split screen moment for millions of viewers. What do you remember about that time?
Well, every network, including CNN and all the mainstream networks that preceded cable, CBS, ABC, they're all carrying it with aerial views from the helicopters and trying to cover it as best they can. But Dick Ebersol, who ran NBC Sports, had a dilemma because it wasn't just a basketball game, it was the NBA Finals. And as I recall, the series was tied 2 games apiece, and it was a close game at Madison Square Garden. And so at various times, I threw it between Marv Albert, who's calling the game. They would come to me upstairs at the Garden. I'd throw it to Tom Brokaw. He would do a summation. At other times, we'd have the split screen, as you mentioned, half the screen the game and half the screen the Bronco chase. And another factor here is that many of us involved for NBC Sports had known and been very friendly with O.J. He and I worked on the football show for NBC for 4 or 5 years, beginning in the early 90s and up until that point. And then subsequently, not that night, but not long after, I learned that O.J., for whatever reason, was trying to call me from the Bronco. I didn't have a cell phone at that time. Those who know me know that I'm behind the technological curve. I had a flip phone until about 3 or 4 years ago. And this was the early days of cell phones, but he had a car phone. So he calls my house in St. Louis, and I wasn't there. I was in New York. Nobody answered the phone. And eventually he called the studio where we did the NFL show from, which was also where we did the NBA show from, but on this occasion, since it was the finals, we were at Madison Square Garden. And the phone rang and rang, apparently tried it a few times, and an engineer eventually answered the phone, and he said, I need to speak to Bob Costas. He's not here. Well, I got to speak to him right away. He's not here. Who's calling? O.J. Simpson. Yeah, right, click. He hung up. Now, I don't know any of this on that Friday night. The series proceeds to Houston, and on Monday, before they're going to play Game 7 a couple of days later, I'm in the hotel, and a woman from Time magazine calls me and says, we hear that O.J. tried to call you from the Bronco. And I say, truthfully at the time, no, that didn't happen. The conversation lasts less than a minute. Now fast forward from June to November of '74, and at his request, I go to visit O.J. in the L.A. County Jail. This is prior to the trial, which didn't start until January. And in the course of some awkward kind of small talk conversation, and Al Cowlings, who was driving the Bronco that night, was there with me, along with Robert Kardashian. It was the 3 of us talking with O.J. And Al Cowlings just kind of casually brings up, you know, we tried to call you from the back of the Bronco. And now I remember the call from the woman at Time magazine, and we begin talking about this, and I said, O.J., why would you be trying to reach me in that moment? And he said, I was being defamed. Not so much about the alleged murders, but my whole life was being defamed. And I thought that maybe you could give a different viewpoint as my friend. And I didn't bother to explain to him what the journalistic imperatives would have been at that time and what I would have had to have asked him if somehow we were patched through, if he was willing to go on the air rather than just talk to me privately. But obviously that's all a moot point because it never happened.
Well, Bob, I mean, I have to ask, what would you have asked O.J. Simpson at that moment that he called you from the Bronco if he was able to reach you?
Yeah, I think the first thing you'd have to ask, Boris, as delicately but still directly as possible, O.J., did you do it? And then let's assume he says, no, I couldn't possibly have done this. Well, O.J., the letter that you wrote to Robert Kardashian that was read by the police officials when they declared you a fugitive of justice, who writes a letter like that, seemingly a suicide note, if they're an innocent man with the kind of wherewithal that you have to defend yourself and the standing you have, good standing, with the American public prior to this? And what are you doing with a gun to your head in the back of the Bronco if, in fact, you're an innocent man? These things don't add up. And whatever his response to that was, it would have been what it was. And then I would have done, in my own way, I guess I would have tried to do what Tom Langmeyer, who I thought was heroic in his role as a policeman, you played the audio earlier on CNN in the way he calmly and compassionately tried to talk O.J. out of doing what he apparently was on the verge of doing, which was killing himself. I would have had to have kind of tried to do the same thing. Say, O.J., whatever it is, you'll have a chance to mount a defense, put the gun down, think of your family, surrender peacefully, and take it from there.
Yeah, and unbelievable story, by the way, Bob. And Mike, I mean, I wonder, when you look back to thinking of that note, thinking of what we heard O.J. say, what we know from the transcript of the Bronco, and then the outcome of the case. You know, whatever the outcome of the case was, what you think about what it does to his legacy, because as he was saying to Bob there, kind of, you know, I would have wanted you basically to speak positively of me, maybe sort of lacking some awareness of what something like this does to someone's legacy, even if they built such an amazing one in sports.
Well, Bob had an unbelievable seat close to that scene, as he just said. That's an incredible story. But now being in the media and doing radio and TV as I was, and the sports icon that O.J. Simpson was, this just brought it into our world. And you couldn't watch all of this from, you know, from the White Bronco to the trial and not have an opinion. My opinion was, and still is, I think he did it. And I think a lot of people feel he did, is going through just what Bob said. Why would you write a note? Why would you potentially be trying to kill yourself? So I think that's where, even though he got acquitted, we know he lost a civil suit. So I think that was the big thing. It was a riveting time for everybody to say, how can this guy in our world, when we're just so used to talking about what a great player he was, and then went into the broadcasting the way he did, and now this, but everything pointed toward it. I mean, I know there were those who said that, hey, he got acquitted, so he's innocent of it and didn't do it, but we all hold our opinion. And I know a lot of people, especially in social media today, were saying, hey, let's let the man, you know, rest in peace with his family and not bring up everything that happened, which that's an impossibility, gang. I mean, you can't bring up O.J. Simpson without bringing up this situation and then the robbery in Vegas, for he eventually went to jail for. It's part and parcel of O.J. Simpson's legacy, both on the field and off.